I was running up Julian Blackwood's marble staircase in a wedding dress when his men cocked their guns. The sound was distinct. A sharp, mechanical click that echoed against the stone walls, louder than the thunder crashing outside, louder even than the blood pounding in my ears. Rain was streaming down my face, ruining the makeup that a team of 3 artists had spent 2 hours perfecting. Mud stained the hem of a gown that cost $15,000, a gown that was supposed to be the symbol of a union between 2 great families but had turned into my shroud. I froze. My chest was heaving. I could feel the cold barrel of a rifle aimed at my back, but I didn't turn around. I couldn't. If I turned around, I would see the faces of men who had been ordered to kill intruders on sight, and if I stopped moving, the terror that I had been shoving down into a dark box in my mind would explode and consume me. I looked up. Standing at the top of the stairs, looking down at me like a god judging a sinner, was Julian Blackwood. I had seen photos of him in the papers, usually blurry shots taken from a distance because no photographer dared to get close. But the photos didn't capture the sheer oppressive weight of his presence. He was tall, wearing a charcoal suit that fit him so perfectly it looked like armor. His face was hard angles and shadows, and his eyes, even from this distance, I could see they were the color of winter ice, cold, merciless. He didn't look surprised to see a soaking wet, muddy bride on his property at 1 a.m. He looked bored, and that terrified me more than the guns. He descended the stairs slowly. 1 step, 2 steps. He moved with the lethal grace of a predator that knows it has already won. He stopped 3 steps above me, forcing me to tilt my head back, exposing my throat. It was a power move. I knew it was a power move because it was exactly what my father would have done. He spoke my name, and it sounded less like a greeting and more like an accusation. He said Elena Vance. He noted that I was Cassian's daughter, standing in his house, dressed for a wedding that was supposed to be happening right now on the other side of the city. He looked at the ruin of my dress and said it was a fascinating turn of events. I tried to speak, but my throat was closed up tight. The memory of what I had heard 4 hours ago slammed into me, choking off my air. 4 hours ago, I wasn't shivering in a Mafia Don's foyer. I was in the bridal suite at the plaza, warm and dry, staring at my reflection and trying to convince myself that marrying Caleb Sterling wasn't the end of the world. It was a business arrangement. I knew that. My father, Robert Vance, needed Caleb's shipping routes. Caleb needed my father's political connections. I was just the ribbon they wrapped around the contract. I remembered sending my maid of honor away to get champagne because I needed a moment of silence. Just one moment to breathe before I signed my life away. That was when I heard them. Voices in the hallway. Just outside the door. They thought the room was empty. I recognized Caleb's laugh immediately. It wasn't the charming, polished laugh he used at charity galas. It was wet and cruel. And then I heard the rasp of his enforcer, a man named Mick. I closed my eyes, standing there on Julian Blackwood's stairs, and forced myself to relive the conversation that had sent me running into the storm. Caleb had told Mick to make it look like an accident. He said those exact words. Make it look like an accident. Blame it on Blackwood. I remembered pressing my hand over my mouth to stop a scream. I remembered leaning against the door, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Mick had asked when. Caleb had answered that they should wait 3 weeks. Let the marriage seem solid. Let the public see the happy couple. Then, a fall down the stairs, or maybe a car brake failure. Something clean. He said that when my body was found, there would be evidence pointing straight to Julian Blackwood. Enough evidence to make my father believe Julian had killed me to start a war. Caleb had laughed again. He said my father was too proud to ask questions. He said Robert Vance would be so blinded by rage that he would burn Julian's empire to the ground. And while the 2 giants destroyed each other, Caleb would step into the vacuum and take everything. And then he said, the thing that made me run, the thing that made me realize I wasn't just a pawn, I was a sacrifice. He said I was disposable. He said I had been trained to be obedient, to smile and wave and not ask questions, and that I would walk into my own execution without ever suspecting a thing. Standing before Julian now, the anger flared up, hot and bright, burning through the fear. Disposable. That was the word that had saved my life, because I refused to be disposable. I looked Julian in the eye. I told myself to stop shaking. I told myself that if I showed fear now, I was dead. I spoke. My voice was raspy, but it didn't crack. I told him that they were going to kill me and blame him. The words tumbled out in a rush. I explained that I had overheard the plot, that Caleb Sterling intended to murder me within the month and plant evidence framing the Blackwood organization. One of the guards behind me shifted, his weapon clattering slightly. Julian didn't blink. His expression didn't change. He asked me simply why I was telling him this. He asked why I hadn't gone to my father. It was the logical question. Why run to the enemy? I took a deep breath. The air in the house smelled of expensive leather and gun oil. I told him the truth. I told him that if I went to my father, he wouldn't believe me. He had spent 6 months negotiating this alliance. If I ran to him with a wild story about a murder plot, he would think I was just a hysterical girl trying to get out of an arranged marriage. He would pat me on the head, give me a sedative, and drag me back to the altar. And then Caleb would just accelerate the timeline. I told Julian that my father saw me as an asset, not a person. Assets don't have opinions. Assets don't uncover conspiracies. Julian tilted his head slightly, studying me. It felt like he was taking me apart, layer by layer, seeing the trembling structure underneath the silk and the bravado. He pointed out that I had chosen him specifically. Not the police, not a flight to Europe. I had come to his door. I said yes. I said I came to him because he was the only person in the city with enough power that my father couldn't just walk in and take me back by force. And more importantly, he was the one with the most to lose if Caleb's plan worked. I stepped up one stair, closing the distance between us. It was a risk. The guards tensed, but Julian didn't move back. I told him that if I died and the evidence pointed to him, my father would come for him with everything he had. It would be a bloodbath. It would cost him men, territory, and money. Caleb Sterling was counting on that war to destroy them both. Julian watched me for a long silence. It stretched out, agonizing and thin. I could hear the rain hammering against the roof. I wondered if this was how I died. Not in a car accident, but here, on these stairs, because I gambled on a monster having a brain. Then, he finally spoke. His voice was low, a rumble that I felt in my chest. He said I was a smart girl. He didn't say it like a compliment. He said it like an assessment, like he was evaluating the sharpness of a knife. He turned to the guard with the scar on his face. He commanded him to lower the weapons. The relief hit me so hard my knees almost buckled. I grabbed the banister to steady myself. The marble was cold under my fingers. Julian caught my elbow. His grip was firm, warm, and shockingly strong. He wasn't gentle, but he wasn't rough either. He held me up as if he knew exactly how close I was to collapsing. He asked if I could walk. I nodded. I said yes. He didn't let go. He told me we were going to his study. He wanted every detail, every word Caleb had said, every name mentioned. He said that if I was lying to him, I wouldn't leave this house alive. I looked at him. I told him I wasn't lying. He smiled then. It wasn't a nice smile. It was sharp enough to cut glass. He said that if I was telling the truth, then Caleb Sterling had just made a very serious mistake. He turned and led me up the stairs, pulling me into the heart of his fortress. We walked down a long hallway lined with dark portraits of men who looked just as ruthless as Julian. The house was quiet, that heavy, watchful silence of a place that holds too many secrets. He opened a set of double doors and gestured for me to enter his study. It was a masculine room, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a massive mahogany desk, and a wall of windows overlooking the storm-tossed ocean. He pointed to a leather chair and told me to sit. I sat. My wet dress pooled around me on the Persian rug, heavy and miserable. I felt ridiculous, a ruined bride in a warlord's den. Julian went to a crystal decanter and poured 2 glasses of amber liquid. He placed one in front of me. Whiskey. No ice. He leaned against the edge of his desk, crossing his ankles, watching me. He told me to drink. I took the glass. My hands were shaking so bad the crystal chimed against my teeth. The whiskey burned going down, hot and grounding. It cleared the fog in my head a little. He told me what was going to happen next. He said I would stay here while he verified my story. If I was telling the truth, I was valuable. If I was lying, I was leverage. Either way, I wasn't leaving until he decided my fate. I set the glass down. I met his gaze. I told him I had a condition. His eyebrows rose. A flicker of amusement, or maybe irritation, crossed his face. He asked if I was in a position to make demands. I said I wasn't making demands. I was negotiating. I thought of my mother. My gentle, soft-spoken mother who had spent her life trying to shield me from the reality of my father's world. And my little sister Chloe, who was only 18 and still thought this life could be romantic. I told him that if Caleb realized I was gone, and if my father found out I was here, they would use my family to get to me. I needed his word. I needed to know that my mother and sister would be safe. Julian swirled the whiskey in his glass, watching the amber liquid catch the light. He asked why he should care about my family. I told him because if he didn't, I would walk out the door right now and take my chances on the street. I told him I was the only witness to a conspiracy that threatened his entire empire. I was the only one who could tell him exactly how Caleb planned to frame him. That information had a price, and the price was my family's safety. He stared at me for a long, dangerous moment. The air in the room felt electric. I was pushing him. I knew I was pushing him. Men like Julian Blackwood didn't like being cornered, especially not by women in wet wedding dresses. Then, he laughed. It was a low, dark sound. He shook his head slowly. He said that maybe Caleb was right to want me dead. He said I was dangerous. He held out his hand. He said we had a deal. I reached out and shook his hand. His skin was rougher than I expected, the hand of a man who wasn't afraid to do his own dirty work. The contact sent a jolt through me, something sharper than fear. He held my hand for a second longer than necessary. He pulled me slightly closer, forcing me to look up at him. He warned me. He said that if this was a trap, if I was acting on my father's orders to infiltrate his house, he would make me regret ever being born. I looked right into those winter eyes. I promised him it wasn't a trap. He released me. He pressed a button on his desk phone and summoned his housekeeper. A few moments later, an older woman with a face like carved granite appeared. Julian told her to put me in the East Wing. He ordered 2 men posted outside my door. He looked back at me. He said, "Welcome to your new cage, princess." The East Wing was luxurious, but it was still a prison. The room they gave me was beautiful in a cold, impersonal way. High ceilings, gray silk walls, a bed that looked like it had never been slept in. But the windows had discreet iron bars worked into the design. And when the housekeeper left, I heard the distinct sound of a heavy lock sliding into place from the outside. I walked to the window and looked out at the rain. The storm was raging, battering against the glass. Somewhere out there, my father was probably tearing the city apart looking for me. Somewhere out there, Caleb was realizing his bride was missing and wondering if his plan was blown. I stripped off the ruined wedding dress. It fell to the floor with a heavy, wet thud. I kicked it away. I hated it. I hated what it represented. I hated that I had spent 6 months designing it, stitching tiny pearls into the bodice, thinking I was creating something beautiful when I was really just decorating a lamb for slaughter. I found a bathrobe in the closet. It was too big, clearly meant for a man. I wrapped it around myself, tying the belt tight. It smelled like cedar and that expensive cologne Julian wore. I sat on the edge of the bed and curled my legs up. I was exhausted, but my mind was racing. I had survived the night. I had escaped the wedding. I had made a deal with the devil, but as I looked at the locked door, I realized the hard part was just beginning. I had bought myself time, but time was a currency that devalued quickly in this world. Tomorrow, Julian would start testing me. He would pick apart my story. He would look for cracks, and I had to be ready. I couldn't just be the girl who ran away. I couldn't just be a witness. Witnesses were liabilities once they had testified. I needed to be more. I remembered the way Julian had looked at me when I analyzed the political situation between him and my father. He had looked interested. Not in my body, but in my mind. That was the key. My father had always told me that my interest in details, in patterns, in the little things people wore and how they stood, was a frivolous hobby. He wanted me to be pretty and silent. But Julian Blackwood was a predator, and predators respected survival instincts. I lay back on the pillows, listening to the rain. I wasn't going to cry. I was done crying. Tomorrow, I wouldn't just give him the information he wanted. I would show him what I could really do. I would prove to him that I wasn't a damsel in distress. I was a strategist who had been forced to hide in a bridal suite, and if I played my cards right, maybe, just maybe, I wouldn't just survive this. Maybe I would win. I didn't sleep. I spent the night staring at the ceiling of my silk-lined cage, listening to the storm fade into a heavy, suffocating silence. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Caleb smile. I heard the mechanical click of the guns on the stairs. I felt the phantom weight of the target painted on my back. When dawn finally broke, it wasn't golden or hopeful. It was a bruise of purple and gray bleeding across the horizon, visible through the iron bars of my window. I sat up. My body ached. Adrenaline is a powerful drug, but the come-down feels like being beaten with a bag of sand. I looked at the floor. The wedding dress was still there, A heap of ruined white silk and mud. It looked like a corpse. In a way, it was. The girl who had sewn those pearls. The girl who had believed she could design her way to a happy ending. She was dead. She had died the moment she heard her fiancé planning her murder. There was a sharp knock at the door. I pulled the oversized robe tighter around myself and said, "Come in." The lock tumbled. The heavy door swung open, and the housekeeper I'd seen the night before marched in. She was carrying a stack of clothes and a tray of black coffee. She didn't look like a woman who tolerated nonsense. She introduced herself as Mrs. Gable. She set the tray down and looked at the dress on the floor. She asked me if I wanted it cleaned. She said the mud was deep, but she knew a few tricks for silk. I looked at the gown. I had spent 6 months on it. I had sketched it a dozen times, sourced the fabric from a tiny mill in Italy, and hand-stitched the lace until my fingers bled. It was my masterpiece. I told her to burn it. Mrs. Gable paused. She looked at me, really looked at me. For the first time, she asked if I was sure. I said I was sure. I told her I never wanted to see it again. I didn't want it cleaned. I didn't want it donated. I wanted it destroyed. She nodded once, a sharp dip of her chin. She respected finality. She picked up the dress, bundling the heavy fabric into her arms without a hint of sentimentality. She pointed to the clothes on the bed. She said, "Mr. Blackwood expected me in his study in 1 hour." She said he didn't like to wait. I showered in a bathroom that was bigger than my bedroom at home. I scrubbed the mud and the hairspray off my skin until I was raw. I washed away the bride. When I stepped out, I dressed in the clothes Mrs. Gable had brought. They were simple. Black slacks that were a little too long, a white button-down shirt that smelled of starch, and a gray cashmere sweater. No jewelry, no makeup. My hair was damp and drying in wild waves around my face. I looked in the mirror. Without the contouring, without the diamonds, without the expensive armor of my social station, I looked young. I looked vulnerable. But my eyes were different. They were harder. I walked to the study at exactly 8 a.m. The guards outside my door fell into step behind me, silent shadows reminding me that I wasn't a guest. I was an asset in storage. Julian was already working. He was sitting behind that massive desk, bathed in the cool morning light, typing on a tablet. He was wearing a fresh suit, navy blue this time, immaculate. He didn't look like a man who had been woken up by a fugitive bride in the middle of the night. He looked like a machine. He didn't look up when I entered. He just pointed to the chair opposite him. I sat. I folded my hands in my lap to keep them from shaking. He finished typing a sentence, set the tablet aside, and finally turned his gaze to me. His eyes swept over my borrowed clothes, my damp hair, my bare face. It was a clinical assessment. He was checking for cracks. He asked me how I slept. I told him I didn't. He said that was honest. He leaned back in his chair. He told me his people had been busy. He said Caleb Sterling had left the Plaza Hotel 20 minutes after I disappeared. He had told my father that I had suffered a nervous breakdown due to the stress of the wedding and had run off. I felt a cold twist in my stomach. A nervous breakdown. It was the perfect cover. It discredited me before I even opened my mouth. If I showed up now claiming conspiracy, I would just look like the hysterical girl Caleb claimed I was. Julian continued. He said my father was spinning the story to the press as pre-wedding jitters. But behind the scenes, the Vance organization was tearing the city apart. They had men at the train stations, the airports, the ferry terminals. He looked at me. He said Caleb was playing it smart. He wasn't acting like a man who lost a target. He was acting like a worried groom, which meant he didn't know I was here. Yet, I asked him about the verification. I asked if he had checked my story. Julian tapped his finger on the desk. He said he had confirmed that Caleb and his enforcer, Mick, were in the hallway at the time, I claimed. He confirmed the timeline, but that wasn't proof of a conspiracy. That was just proof of opportunity. He needed more. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gray ocean. He said I claimed to be observant. I claimed to see patterns. I said I did. He turned back to me. He said that for the next few hours, I wasn't Serafina Vance, the debutante designer. I was an analyst. He said he was going to give me raw data surveillance photos, financial records, movement logs from Caleb's inner circle over the last month. He wanted me to find the anomaly. He wanted me to find the proof that backed up my story. He placed a heavy tablet in front of me. He told me that if I found something his own people had missed, I stayed. We moved to the next phase. If I found nothing, if I was just a scared girl with a good imagination. Well, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I pulled the tablet closer. My hands were steady now. This was work. This was familiar. For the next 3 hours, the only sound in the room was the ticking of a grandfather clock and the occasional tap of my finger on the glass screen. I started with the financial records. It was a mess of shell companies and offshore transfers, the standard geography of money laundering. I saw nothing obvious. Caleb was careful. I moved to the movement logs. Dates, times, locations. Again, nothing screamed murder plot. Then I opened the folder marked surveillance, personnel. It contained hundreds of high-resolution photos taken by Julian's spies, photos of Caleb, photos of his captains, photos of his foot soldiers coming and going from nightclubs, warehouses, and restaurants. I scrolled through them, my eyes scanning for details. I wasn't looking for guns or drugs. I was looking for the things I knew: fabric, fit, accessories, the subtle language of wealth and pretension that these men spoke without realizing it. I stopped at a photo taken 2 weeks ago outside a club called the Sapphire Room. It showed a group of Caleb's men. In the center was Mick, the enforcer whose voice I had heard in the hallway, the man who was supposed to kill me. I zoomed in. I looked at his wrist. I looked at his cuffs. I looked at his shoes. I felt a sudden, sharp spike of adrenaline. It was the same feeling I got when a design finally clicked into place, when the chaos of lines became a structure. I looked at 3 more photos of Mick, taken on different days over the last month. The pattern held. I sat back in my chair. I looked up. Julian was watching me. He hadn't moved from his desk, but I knew he hadn't missed a single breath I took. I told him I found it. He didn't look impressed yet. He just asked what I found. I turned the tablet around and pushed it toward him. I pointed to the photo of Mick outside the club. I asked Julian to look at his watch. Julian glanced at it. He said it was a Patek Philippe Nautilus, platinum, blue dial. I nodded. I said the retail price was around $120,000, but on the gray market, it was closer to $200,000. Julian's eyes narrowed slightly. He asked what my point was. I pointed to the cuff of Mick's shirt. I told him to look at the cufflink. It was a simple silver knot, mass-produced. You could buy a pair for $50 at any department store. I looked Julian in the eye. I explained the discrepancy. I told him that a man who buys a $200,000 watch doesn't wear $50 cufflinks. Not unless he doesn't understand what he's buying. Not unless the money is new, fast, and unearned. I pointed to his suit. It was off the rack, ill-fitting at the shoulders. The fabric was a cheap blend. I laid out my analysis. I said Mick was a mid-level enforcer. His salary on paper, and even his illegal cuts, shouldn't allow him to buy a watch that cost more than a small house. I said he was wearing a windfall on his wrist. He was flashing cash he wasn't supposed to have. And the fact that his other accessories didn't match the quality meant he wasn't used to having that kind of money. It was a recent payment, a very large payment. Julian was silent. He was studying the photo with a new intensity. I wasn't done. I swiped to the next photo. I pointed to the background. In the shadow of the doorway, partially obscured, was another man. He was barely visible, but I recognized the cut of his jacket. It was a bespoke piece, Neapolitan tailoring, a very specific shoulder line. I told Julian that the man in the shadows was wearing a suit from a tailor in Rome that only had a waiting list of 50 clients. My father used the same tailor. I asked Julian who in his organization shopped in Rome. Julian went still. The air in the room dropped 10 degrees. He zoomed in on the shadowy figure. He looked at the shoulder line I had pointed out. He whispered a name. Niko Volkov. My breath caught. Niko Volkov was one of Julian's top lieutenants. I had seen him at galas, shaking hands, smiling. I connected the dots for him. I said Mick, Caleb's enforcer, suddenly has enough cash to buy a Patek, and he is being photographed within 10 feet of your lieutenant Niko Volkov, in a location that is supposed to be neutral ground. I said Caleb didn't just plan to frame you. He bought one of your men to make sure the frame stuck. Niko is the mole. He's the one who's going to plant the evidence after I'm dead. Julian stared at the tablet for a long time. His face was a mask, but I could see the rage simmering behind his eyes. It was a cold, calculated fury. Betrayal in this world wasn't just an insult. It was a death sentence. He picked up his desk phone. He dialed a number. He spoke 2 sentences. Bring Volkov to the basement. Do it quietly. He hung up. He stood slowly and walked around the desk until he was standing right in front of me. I had to tilt my head back to meet his gaze. He was close enough that I could smell the starch of his shirt and the danger radiating off him. He looked at me. really looked at me. Not as a nuisance. Not as a refugee. He said I was right. He said Volkov had been making unscheduled trips to Rome. He said he had missed it because he was looking for large bank transfers, not tailoring details. He admitted that his analysts looked at numbers. I looked at people. I felt a strange warmth bloom in my chest. It was pride. For the first time in my life, a man was looking at me and seeing my brain, not my face. My father had never looked at me like this. Caleb certainly hadn't. Julian leaned against the edge of the desk, crossing his arms. He asked me what else I saw. I blinked. I asked what he meant. He gestured to the room, to himself, to the situation. He said I had dissected a traitor in 5 minutes using nothing but a photograph of a watch and a suit jacket. He wanted to know what else I saw when I looked at his world. I hesitated. Then I decided to be bold. I had nothing left to lose. I looked at him. I told him I saw a man who was tired. His eyes tightened at the corners. He didn't speak. I continued. I said his suit was perfect. His office was a fortress, and his reputation was terrifying. But he was checking his phone every 3 minutes, even when it didn't buzz. He was pouring whiskey at 1 in the morning on a Tuesday. I said he was fighting a war on 3 fronts, and he was doing it alone because he didn't trust anyone enough to delegate, and that was why he missed Volkov. He was looking at the macro, the big picture, the empire. He needed someone who looked at the micro, the details, the cracks. Silence stretched between us. I wondered if I had gone too far. I wondered if analyzing the Don himself was a step too close to the ledge. Then, the corner of his mouth quirked up. It wasn't a smile, not really. It was an acknowledgement. He said I was dangerous, Elena Vance. He used my name. Not Princess, not Cassian's daughter. My name. He pushed off the desk. He walked to the door and opened it. He told the guards to stand down. He turned back to me. He said we were going to lunch. I stared at him. Lunch? He nodded. He said we had a mole to deal with, and then we had a meeting to arrange. He said if I was right about Volkov, then we had the leverage we needed. He said we were going to meet my father. My stomach dropped. I asked if he was sending me back. Julian looked at me, and his expression was unreadable. He said no. He said he wasn't sending me back. We were going to negotiate, but this time, I wasn't going to be the bargaining chip on the table. He said I was going to be the player sitting at it. He told me to get up. He said we had work to do. I stood up. My legs felt steadier than they had in 24 hours. I looked at the tablet, at the picture of the watch that had unraveled a conspiracy. I looked at Julian Blackwood, the monster in the navy suit. I realized then that the cage had changed. The door was open, and for the first time I wasn't looking for an exit. I was looking for a weapon. I walked toward him. I said I was ready. He held the door for me. He didn't touch me, but the air between us crackled with a new kind of tension. It wasn't fear anymore. It was potential. As I walked out of the study and into the hallway, leaving the girl I used to be behind in the gray room with the ashes of her wedding dress, I knew one thing for certain. Caleb Sterling had made a mistake. He thought I was disposable. He was about to find out just how expensive I really was. The drive to the meeting place was silent. I sat in the back of Julian's armored SUV, watching the city blur past the tinted windows. It was raining again. A soft, miserable drizzle that made New York look like a watercolor painting left out in the damp. Beside me, Julian was checking messages on his phone. He was calm, unnaturally calm. I, on the other hand, felt like I was vibrating. My father, Robert Vance, had agreed to the meeting. That in itself was a miracle. Or a trap. In my world, the difference between a peace summit and an execution was usually just a matter of who walked through the door first. Julian locked his phone and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He looked at me. He didn't ask if I was okay. He knew I wasn't. Instead, he asked if I remembered the plan. I nodded. I told him I remembered. I present the evidence. I make the accusation. He provides the muscle if things go sideways. He corrected me. He said he provides the muscle regardless. But the accusation had to come from me. He said that for my father to believe this, to really believe it, he had to see that I wasn't being coerced. He had to see that his daughter wasn't a pawn anymore. I looked down at my hands. I was still wearing the borrowed clothes, but Mrs. Gable had found me a blazer that fit a little better. I felt like an imposter in a business suit. I asked Julian what happened if my father didn't believe me. Julian looked out the window. He said that if Robert Vance was too stupid to see the truth when it was laid out in front of him, then we walked away. I asked what he meant by we. He turned back to me, his gray eyes catching the streetlights. He said that I had earned my place at the table, Elena. He said he didn't abandon his partners. Partners. The word hung in the air between us, heavy and strange. The car slowed to a stop. We were at the Alabaster, a restaurant that sat on the border between the Vance territory and the Blackwood district. It was Switzerland with white tablecloths. The driver opened the door. I stepped out into the cool night air. Julian was right behind me, a solid, warm presence at my back. His men fanned out, efficient and terrifyingly professional. We walked into the private dining room at the back. My father was already there. Robert Vance sat at the head of a long mahogany table, flanked by two of his own guards. He looked exactly as I remembered him, impeccable, cold. He didn't look like a man whose daughter had been missing for 24 hours. He looked like a CEO whose merger was running behind schedule. When he saw me, he didn't stand up. He didn't rush over to hug me. He just gestured to the empty chair across from him. He told me to sit. I sat. Julian took the chair next to me. The tension in the room was so thick you could taste it, like copper and ozone. My father looked at Julian, then at me. He asked for an explanation. He said I had caused quite a scene. He said Caleb was frantic. I placed the folder Julian had prepared on the table. I didn't slide it. I placed it down with a deliberate thud. I told him that Caleb wasn't frantic. Caleb was terrified that I was still alive. My father's expression didn't change. He asked what I was talking about. I opened the folder. I laid out the photos of Mick, the watch, the surveillance of the meetings, and the confession Julian had extracted from Nico Volkov in the basement just 2 hours ago. It was a written confession, stained with a little bit of blood, but legible. I spoke clearly. I told my father that Caleb Sterling planned to murder me 3 weeks after the wedding. I told him about the frame job. I told him that Caleb viewed me as disposable, a sacrificial lamb to start a war that would leave the Vance Empire in ruins. My father picked up the confession. He read it slowly. His face was a mask of stone. I watched him. I waited for the outrage. I waited for the fatherly instinct to kick in, the anger that someone dared to touch his child. But it didn't come. Instead, he looked at Julian. He asked if the source was reliable. Julian spoke for the first time. His voice was bored, almost lazy. He said the source was his own lieutenant, who was currently breathing through a tube. He said the intel was solid. My father nodded. He closed the folder. Then, the door to the private room opened. My heart hammered against my ribs. Caleb Sterling walked in. He looked perfect. He was wearing a black suit, his hair perfectly styled, his face arranged into a mask of exquisite worry. When he saw me, he stopped. He did a double take that was worthy of an Oscar. "Elena!" He rushed toward me. He said, "Thank God." He said he had been so worried. He reached out to touch me. I didn't flinch. I didn't scream. I just looked at him. Julian shifted slightly in his chair. It was a tiny movement, but it was enough. Caleb stopped 3 feet away, his survival instinct overriding his performance. My father spoke. He told Caleb to sit down. Caleb looked confused. He looked from me to Julian to my father. He asked what was going on. He asked why I was with Blackwood. My father pushed the folder across the table toward Caleb. He said that my daughter had brought some interesting reading material. Caleb opened the folder. I watched his face. I watched the color drain out of it. I watched the moment the arrogant, confident facade cracked and revealed the rat underneath. He looked up. He tried to laugh. It sounded brittle. He said this was insane. He said Blackwood had brainwashed me. He said these photos were faked. He looked at me with pleading eyes. He asked me why I was doing this. He asked if I was having another episode. I felt a cold, hard rage settle in my chest. Another episode. That was his narrative. That I was crazy. That I was weak. I leaned forward. I spoke softly. I told him I wasn't having an episode, Caleb. I was having a moment of clarity. I told him I heard him. In the hallway. I repeated his own words back to him. Disposable. Bargaining chip. Clean accident. Caleb's mouth opened and closed. He looked at my father. He started to stammer. He said it was a misunderstanding. He said he was just venting. My father raised a hand. Silence fell instantly. My father looked at Caleb. He spoke calmly. He said that he could forgive ambition. He said he understood the desire to expand territory. Caleb nodded eagerly, thinking he saw a lifeline. But then my father's eyes went cold. He said that what he could not forgive was the insult to his intelligence. He said Caleb thought he could kill a Vance daughter and use her corpse to manipulate him. He said Caleb thought he was stupid enough to fall for a frame job. My father stood up. He said the alliance was terminated. He nodded to his guards. They moved fast. Before Caleb could even stand, they had him. One guard grabbed his arms, the other jammed a pistol into his ribs. Caleb started screaming. He screamed that it was a lie. He screamed that I was a whore who was sleeping with the enemy. Julian didn't move. He just watched, sipping his water, as if this was mild entertainment. They dragged Caleb out the back door. His screams cut off abruptly as the heavy door slammed shut. I sat there, listening to the silence that followed. I felt a strange cocktail of emotions. Relief, yes. Vindication, absolutely. But mostly, I felt hollow. It was over. The threat was gone. My father sat back down. He adjusted his cufflinks. He looked at me. He said I did well. I looked up, surprised. He said I showed initiative. He said bringing the information to him directly, with evidence, was a smart move. He said he was impressed. For a split second, a tiny, foolish part of me bloomed with hope. I thought maybe, just maybe, he saw me. Then he continued. He said to come home. He said my mother was waiting. He said we would have to do some damage control with the press. The broken engagement would look bad, but we could spin it. He picked up his phone. He said he already had a few calls to make. There was a potential opening with the Russo family in Chicago. Their eldest son was looking for a wife. It would be a good match, a stronger alliance than the Sterling deal. I stared at him. The words echoed in my head. The Russo family, a good match. He wasn't taking me home to protect me. He was taking me home to restock the shelf. I was a product that had been returned due to a defect in the buyer, and now he was looking for a new customer. Something inside me snapped. It wasn't a loud snap. It was the quiet sound of the last string connecting me to my childhood breaking. I stood up. My father looked up from his phone, annoyed. He asked what I was doing. I said I wasn't going home. He frowned. He asked what I meant. I said I wasn't going back to that house. I wasn't going to be packaged and sold to the Russos or anyone else. I was done being traded. My father put his phone down. His voice dropped an octave. He warned me. He said I was distraught. He said I didn't know what I was saying. I looked him in the eye. I told him I knew exactly what I was saying. I told him that for 24 years, I had done everything he asked. I had dressed right, spoke right, smiled right, and my reward was almost being murdered by a man he chose for me. I pointed to the door where Caleb had been dragged out. I said that he, my father, didn't save me. I saved myself. I ran. I negotiated. I found the evidence. My father stood up. He looked towering and furious. He said I was his daughter. I belonged in his house. I shook my head. I said I wasn't property, father. He sneered. He asked where I thought I was going. He looked at Julian. He asked if I thought this man was my savior. He laughed. He told me that Julian Blackwood was a monster who would use me and discard me faster than Caleb ever would. I looked down at Julian. He was still sitting, relaxed, watching the exchange. He hadn't interfered. He hadn't tried to save me. He was letting me fight my own battle, and that was the difference. My father wanted to own me. Caleb wanted to discard me. Julian was just watching to see what I would do. I looked back at my father. I told him that Julian might be a monster, but he was a monster who kept his deals. I told him I was staying with Blackwood. My father's face went purple. He signaled to his guards. He said, "Take her." The guards stepped forward. That was when Julian moved. He didn't stand up. He just placed his hand on the table. A simple, heavy gesture. The guards froze. Julian spoke. His voice was soft, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. He said that Elena had made her choice. Robert. My father turned his rage on Julian. He accused him of kidnapping. He said this was an act of war. Julian finally stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He looked my father in the eye. He said it wasn't a kidnapping. It was a partnership. He said that if Robert wanted to start a war over a daughter he was planning to sell to Chicago next week, he was welcome to try. But he reminded my father that he, Julian, now had the territory maps and financial codes that Volkov had spilled in the basement. He said, "I know where your money is, Robert. Don't make me burn it." My father went pale. He knew he was outmaneuvered. He looked at me one last time. There was no love in his eyes, only calculation and loss. He said that if I walked out that door, I was dead to him. He said I was no longer a Vance, I felt a tear slip down my cheek, hot and fast. I wiped it away. I said that was fine. I didn't want to be a Vance anymore. I turned to Julian. I asked if we could go. He nodded. He placed a hand on the small of my back. It wasn't possessive. It was guiding. We walked out of the private room, past my father's frozen guards, past my father who was staring at the table like he was trying to calculate his losses. We walked out into the main restaurant, past diners who had no idea that a dynasty had just fractured in the back room. We stepped out into the rain. The air felt different. It was cold and wet, but it felt clean. Julian opened the car door for me. But before I got in, I stopped. I looked at him. I asked him why. I asked why he stood up for me. He looked at me, raindrops catching in his dark lashes. He said he told me already. He liked smart people, and he hated waste. He said my father was wasting me. He leaned closer. He said that now that I was dead to my family, I needed a job. I asked what kind of job. He smiled. It was the first real smile I had seen on his face. It was dangerous, yes, but it was also inviting. He said he had an empire to run, and he was short one analyst. I looked at the car. I looked at the dark city skyline. I looked at the man who offered me a cliff instead of a cage. I got in the car. As we drove away, leaving my father and my past behind in the rearview mirror, I realized something. I wasn't just safe, I was free. And for the first time in my life, I was going to decide what I was worth. 6 months is a long time in the regular world. In the world Julian Blackwood and I inhabited, it was a lifetime. In 6 months, empires could rise and fall. Alliances could be forged in blood and broken in boardrooms. And girls who used to run from their own weddings could turn into women who ran the city's most exclusive intelligence network. I stood in the center of Elena Vance, adjusting the drape of emerald silk on a mannequin. The shop was located in a converted brownstone in the Upper East Side, a property Julian had acquired quietly through a shell company. From the outside, it looked like just another high-end boutique, the kind where the prices weren't listed on the tags because if you had to ask, you couldn't afford it. But inside, it was a fortress of soft lighting, plush velvet, and secrets. The sign on the door said, "By appointment only," and getting an appointment required more than just a heavy credit card. It required a background check that I ran personally. My client list had grown quickly. The wives of senators, the daughters of CEOs, the mistresses of rival cartel leaders. They came for the designs because my work was genuinely good, but they stayed for the sanctuary. I had learned a fundamental truth about powerful men's wives. They were lonely, they were often ignored, and when you put them in a fitting room with a glass of champagne and a sympathetic ear, they talked. They spilled secrets that their husbands would kill to protect, usually while complaining about those same husbands. The bell above the door chimed. It was Mrs. Caroline Thorne, the wife of the city's zoning commissioner. She was 45, impeccably preserved, and currently furious about her husband's late nights. I greeted her with a smile. I guided her to the private fitting suite. I offered her sparkling water with a twist of lemon. For the next hour, while I pinned the hem of her gala gown, I listened. She complained that her husband, Marcus, was stressed. She said he was holding secret meetings at the docks with a construction firm called Apex. She said he was terrified of an audit. She mentioned a date, next Tuesday, the vote on the waterfront redevelopment project. I nodded sympathetically. I told her that men were always so dramatic about work. I complimented her figure. I told her the blue brought out her eyes. When she left, happy and unburdened, I locked the door. I went straight to my office in the back. I pulled up the secure server Julian had installed. I typed in the name Apex Construction. It took me 10 minutes to find the connection. Apex was a subsidiary of a shell company owned by the Russo family in Chicago. The same family my father had tried to sell me to. They were trying to buy the waterfront under Julian's nose. I typed up the report. Target, Commissioner Thorne. Action, compromised by Russo. Event, waterfront vote next Tuesday. I hit send. That was the job. That was the partnership. I was the spider in the center of a web of silk and gossip, feeling the vibrations before the prey even knew they were trapped. I left the atelier at 7 p.m. Julian's driver was waiting. The drive back to the estate was different now. 6 months ago, I had sat in the back of that car terrified, wondering if I was being driven to a prison. Now, I sat with my laptop open, reviewing the quarterly earnings of the legitimate side of our business. When I arrived at the estate, the guards nodded to me. Not as a guest, as a resident. as the woman who had the ear of the king. I found Julian in his study, the same room where I had stood in my wet wedding dress and negotiated for my life. Now, it felt like my second office. He was pouring drinks. He heard me come in and didn't turn around, but I saw his shoulders relax. It was a subtle thing, something only I would notice. The tension that he carried all day, the armor of the dawn, slipped just a fraction when I was in the room. He handed me a glass of wine, a heavy, dark red. He knew my taste now. He asked how the day was. I told him about Mrs. Thorne. I told him about the Russos and the waterfront deal. Julian took a sip of his whiskey. He smiled. It wasn't the sharp, cutting smile he used on his enemies. It was the slow, appreciative smile he saved for me. He said I just saved him $10 million in a territory war. I sat on the edge of his desk. I told him he was welcome. He moved closer. He stood between my knees, looking down at me. The air in the room changed. It always did lately. For the first few months, we had been strictly professional, careful. I was recovering from trauma. He was respecting boundaries. But in the last few weeks, the boundaries had started to blur. We spent late nights here, analyzing data, debating strategy. We operated as a single unit, my intuition and his force, my patterns and his power. And with that intellectual intimacy came something else, a heat that simmered under every conversation. He reached out and touched the lapel of my jacket. His fingers brushed the skin of my throat, leaving a trail of fire. He said I looked tired. I told him I was fine. I told him building an empire was exhausting work. He laughed softly. He said we weren't just building an empire, Elena. We were securing a legacy. He looked at my eyes, then down to my mouth, then back up. The intent was clear. I held his gaze. I wasn't afraid. I wanted this. I had chosen this life, and I had chosen him. Not as a savior, but as an equal. I told him that Mrs. Thorne asked me today if I was married. Julian went still. He asked what I told her. I said I told her no. I told her I was married to my work. Julian stepped closer, eliminating the space between us. He placed his hands on the desk on either side of me, boxing me in, but I didn't feel trapped. I felt centered. He asked if that was true. I said it was partially true. I said I was committed to the work, but I was also committed to the partner who made the work possible. He leaned down. His face was inches from mine. I could smell the whiskey and the cedar and the storm that always seemed to cling to him. He whispered that he didn't want me to be married to the work. He wanted me to be his. I asked him to define his. He said he meant in every way that mattered. In the boardroom, in the war room, and in the bedroom. He said he was tired of pretending that he didn't want to burn the world down every time another man looked at me. I reached up and placed my hand on his chest, right over his heart. It was beating steady and strong, a heavy rhythm against my palm. I told him I wasn't a possession, Julian. I wasn't something to be owned. He covered my hand with his. He said he knew. He said he didn't want to own me. You don't own a storm. You just pray it doesn't destroy you. He said he wanted to be with me. As partners. As equals. That was the word. Equals. I closed the distance. I kissed him. It wasn't tentative. It wasn't sweet. It was 6 months of adrenaline and danger, and suppressed desire finally exploding. It was acclaiming. His hands tangled in my hair, pulling me closer, deepening the kiss until the world narrowed down to just the taste of him and the feel of his body against mine. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine. He asked if I was sure. I told him I had never been more sure of anything. I told him I ran from a wedding to get here. I ran from safety to find this. He kissed me again, slower this time. He picked me up off the desk, carrying me effortlessly, not toward the door, but toward the private elevator that led to the penthouse suite above the study. That night, I didn't sleep in the East Wing. I didn't sleep in the cage. I slept in the master bedroom, wrapped in Julian's arms, surrounded by sheets that smelled like him. But before we slept, lying there in the dark, we talked. Not about business, not about enemies, about us. He told me about his childhood, about growing up in the shadow of a father who was cruel and a mother who was silent. He told me he learned early that love was a weakness, a handle that people used to manipulate you. I listened. I traced the scars on his chest with my fingertips. I told him about my own father, about being raised as a commodity, about the lessons on how to sit, how to smile, how to be the perfect silent wife. I told him I always thought my brain was a defect, something I had to hide. Julian took my hand and kissed my knuckles. He said my brain was the most dangerous thing about me. He said he fell in love with my mind before he ever touched my skin. Love. He hadn't said the word explicitly, but it hung there in the silence. I realized then that this wasn't just a romance. This was an alliance of souls. We were two people who had been shaped by a brutal world, who had learned to survive by being harder and colder than everyone else. And somehow, in the wreckage of our pasts, we had found the one person who understood the language we spoke. The next morning, the dynamic in the house shifted. When I walked into the breakfast room, Mrs. Gable didn't raise an eyebrow. She just set a second-place setting next to Julian's at the head of the table. The guards didn't look at me as the guest anymore. They looked at me with a new kind of deference. I was the Dawn's woman. But more than that, I was the one who found the moles. I was the one who predicted the hits. I sat down next to Julian. He was reading the paper. He put his hand on my thigh under the table, a possessive, grounding touch. He passed me a file. He said this came in this morning. I opened it. It was a report on Caleb Sterling, or what was left of him. After my father had dragged him out of the restaurant, Caleb hadn't been killed. That would have been too merciful. My father had stripped him of his rank, his money, and his name. He was currently rotting in a private prison facility upstate, waiting for a trial that would likely never happen. But the file wasn't about Caleb. It was about his remaining loyalists. I scanned the pages. There were whispers, rumors of a regrouping. A man named Silas, Caleb's younger brother, was back in town. He was unstable, violent, and looking for revenge. I looked up at Julian. I said Silas Sterling was dangerous. He didn't care about business or territory. He only cared about blood. Julian nodded. He said Silas blamed us for destroying his brother. He blamed me specifically. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Julian squeezed my hand. He said we would handle it. He said he had doubled the security at the atelier. He said I wasn't to go anywhere without a 4-man team. I closed the file. I looked at the man who was now my lover and my partner. I told him I wasn't afraid. He looked at me with those winter eyes, now warm with something fierce and protective. He said he knew I wasn't. He said that was why he worried, because I didn't know when to run anymore. I smiled. I told him I was done running. I had built something here. I had built a life, a business, and a home, and I wasn't going to let a ghost from my past burn it down. Julian brought my hand to his lips. He said, "Then we fight, together." As I went to work that day, stepping into the armored car, I felt the shift in the air. The honeymoon phase of our victory was over. The peace we had bought with Caleb's downfall had expired. Silas Sterling was coming. And he wasn't coming to negotiate. But as I looked at the ring on my right hand, a simple diamond band Julian had given me over breakfast, not an engagement ring, but a promise ring, I knew we were ready. I wasn't the girl on the stairs anymore. I was Elena Vance. I was the architect of an empire. And if Silas wanted a war, we would give him one he would never wake up from. The meeting was set for midnight at the old shipyard on the Brooklyn waterfront. It was the kind of place that didn't exist on tourist maps, a graveyard of rusted shipping containers and cranes that looked like the skeletons of prehistoric beasts. Julian didn't like it. I could tell by the way he checked his weapon 3 times before we got out of the car. He told me that the broker, a man named Rinaldi, claimed to have information on Silas Sterling's location. Rinaldi insisted on a face-to-face meet, alone, on neutral ground. In our world, neutral ground usually meant killing field. I told Julian I should stay in the car. It was standard protocol for the non-combatant to stay behind the bulletproof glass. But Julian shook his head. He said Rinaldi specifically asked for me. He claimed the information involved the atelier. He said Silas was targeting my business partners. That was the bait. And we both knew it was bait. But when you're hunting a ghost like Silas Sterling, sometimes you have to step into the trap to find the trigger. We walked into the center of the shipyard. The wind was whipping off the East River, smelling of salt and decay. The only light came from a few flickering sodium lamps high above on the poles, casting long, twitching shadows that danced across the pavement. Rinaldi was waiting for us by a stack of blue containers. He was a small man, nervous, shifting his weight from foot to foot. He looked like a rat that smelled a cat but couldn't find the exit. Julian stopped 10 feet away. His body was loose, ready. I stood slightly behind him, my eyes scanning the perimeter. I wasn't looking for guns. I was looking for anomalies. Rinaldi started talking fast. He was saying he didn't want trouble. He said Silas approached him, demanded shipping manifests for the fabrics I imported from Italy. He said Silas was looking for a way to smuggle something into my shipments. I listened to Rinaldi, but I watched the environment. I looked at the containers stacked around us. They formed a U-shape, a perfect acoustic trap. I looked at the ground. There were tire tracks in the mud near the water's edge. Heavy tracks, fresh, but there was no vehicle there. Then I looked up at the light pole directly above us. The bulb was buzzing, flickering in a rhythmic, staccato pattern. Buzz, click, buzz. Buzz, click, buzz. It wasn't a faulty wire. It was too regular. It was a signal. My gaze snapped to the left, to a dark alleyway created by 2 rows of containers. I saw it. Just the glint of a side mirror catching the flickering light. A panel van, painted matte black, parked deep in the shadows where no vehicle should be. It was positioned perfectly to accelerate into the open space where we were standing. I looked back at Rinaldi. He wasn't looking at Julian. He was looking past us, toward the van. He was sweating, despite the cold wind. The pieces clicked together in my mind with terrifying clarity. The nervous broker, the acoustic trap, the hidden vehicle, the signal. It wasn't a meeting. It was a bowling alley, and we were the pins. I didn't think. I didn't calculate. I just reacted. I grabbed the back of Julian's jacket and screamed his name. At the same moment, the engine of the van roared to life. It sounded like a dragon waking up. Tires squealed against the pavement as it surged out of the shadows, headlights blinding us. Julian moved instantly. He didn't turn to look. He trusted me. He spun around, grabbing me by the waist, and threw us both sideways, behind the heavy steel of the blue container just as the van screamed past the spot where we had been standing. Then the world turned white. The van didn't hit us. It hit the container Rinaldi was standing next to. The explosion was a physical blow. It punched the air out of my lungs and slammed me into the wet asphalt. The sound was deafening, a roar that vibrated through my bones. Heat washed over me, searing and intense, followed by a shower of debris, metal, glass, and fire raining down like hell's confetti. I lay there for a second, stunned, my ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. The smell of burning rubber and gasoline filled my nose. Then I felt the weight on top of me. Julian. He had covered me. He had used his own body as a shield against the blast wave and the shrapnel. I pushed at his shoulders. I called his name, but I couldn't hear my own voice over the ringing. He groaned. He rolled off me, his movement stiff and pained. I scrambled to my knees. The shipyard was chaos. Rinaldi was gone, vaporized or buried under the burning wreckage. Julian's men were shouting, returning fire at shadows moving on the periphery. Silas's kill team had arrived to finish what the bomb started. I looked at Julian. He was trying to stand, but his left leg gave way. There was a dark stain spreading rapidly across the thigh of his trousers. A piece of shrapnel, a big one. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to seize my throat, but I shoved it down. I remembered what Julian had told me. You don't own a storm. You survive it. I grabbed him. I pulled his arm over my shoulder. I told him we had to move. He gritted his teeth, his face pale in the firelight. He nodded. He forced himself up, leaning his weight on me. We stumbled through the maze of containers, moving away from the firelight, into the shadows. Bullets sparked against the metal walls around us. I could hear the shouts of Silas's men closing in. They knew we were hurt. They were hunting. I dragged Julian into a narrow gap between 2 rusted cranes. It was tight, dark, and smelled of oil. I eased him down against the cold metal. He hissed in pain, his hand clutching his leg. The blood was flowing too fast. It was black in the darkness, soaking his hand, soaking the ground. I needed a tourniquet. I ripped off my silk scarf. It wasn't enough. I looked at his belt. I unbuckled it, my hands slick with his blood. I wrapped it around his thigh, high up near the hip, and pulled it tight. Julian gasped, his head falling back against the metal. He gripped my wrist, his strength terrifying even now. He told me to leave him. He told me to run. He said they wanted him, not me. I looked at him. I looked at the man who had given me an empire, who had burned the world to keep me warm. I told him to shut up. I told him I wasn't going anywhere. I tightened the belt another notch. He groaned, his eyes rolling back slightly. I grabbed his radio from his belt. I keyed the mic. I didn't know the codes, so I just spoke plain English. I said this was Elena Vance. I said the dawn was down. I gave our coordinates. I told them to bring the car around to the north gate. A voice crackled back. It was his head of security. He sounded relieved and terrified. He said they were 2 minutes out. 2 minutes. It sounded like a lifetime. I looked out at the gap. I could see flashlights sweeping the darkness. They were close. Maybe 30 yards. Julian was fading. The blood loss was making him shocky. He was shivering. I took off my blazer and wrapped it around him. It was a pathetic gesture against the cold, but it was all I had. He looked at me, his eyes unfocused. He whispered my name. He asked if I was hurt. I touched his face. My hand was shaking, but not from fear anymore. From rage. I told him I was fine. I told him he saved me. He tried to smile. He said that was the job. I shook my head. I told him that wasn't the job. That was the partnership. A flashlight beam cut across the opening of our hiding spot. I froze. I heard footsteps. Heavy boots on gravel. Someone was right outside. I looked at Julian's gun. It was still in his holster. I had never fired a gun. I hated them. They were loud, clumsy instruments of blunt force. I preferred secrets and leverage, but leverage wouldn't stop a bullet. I pulled the gun from his holster. It was heavy. Heavier than I expected. I remembered what he had taught me during one of our late-night talks, theoretically. Safety off. Slide back. Aim center mass. I stood up. I positioned myself in front of Julian. The footsteps stopped. A shadow loomed at the entrance of the gap. A man stepped in. He was wearing tactical gear, a rifle raised. He wasn't one of ours. He saw me. He saw the gun in my shaking hands. He started to smile. I didn't give him time to speak. I didn't give him time to aim. I pulled the trigger. The recoil jarred my arm all the way to the shoulder. The sound was a thunderclap in the small space. I missed his center mass. I hit his shoulder, but it was enough. He spun around, dropping his rifle, shouting in pain. Before he could recover, 3 shots rang out from behind him. The man dropped. I saw Julian's head of security standing there, smoking gun in hand. Behind him were 6 more of our men. I lowered the gun. My knees turned to water. They swarmed us. Hands grabbed me, pulling me back. Medics were on Julian instantly, cutting away his pant leg, shouting vitals. They lifted him onto a stretcher. As they carried him past me, he reached out. His hand, bloody and shaking, searched the air. I took it. I squeezed it. I told him I was here. I told him I was right here. The ride to the safe house was a blur of sirens and shouting. They didn't take him to a hospital, too many questions, too much exposure. We had a private surgical suite in a townhouse in Chelsea. I waited in the hallway while they operated. I was covered in soot, mud, and Julian's blood. I still had the gun in my pocket. I hadn't let anyone take it. 3 hours later, the doctor came out. He looked tired. He said Julian was lucky. The shrapnel missed the femoral artery by a fraction of an inch. He had lost a lot of blood, but he would recover. I nodded. I didn't cry. I think I had forgotten how to cry. I walked into the recovery room. Julian was awake. He looked pale, almost gray against the white pillows. An IV line ran into his arm. When he saw me, he tried to sit up. I pushed him back down gently. I sat on the edge of the bed. I took his hand. He looked at my clothes, at the blood that wasn't mine. He asked if I was okay. I told him I shot a man. He blinked. He squeezed my hand weakly. He asked if I killed him. I said no. I said I aimed for the center but pulled to the left. He smiled. A weak, tired smile. He said we would work on my aim. I didn't smile back. I leaned forward, resting my forehead against his shoulder. I started to shake. The adrenaline was finally leaving, and the terror was rushing in to fill the void. I told him he was an idiot. I told him he could have died. He moved his hand to stroke my hair. He said he calculated the risk. I pulled back. I looked at him angrily. I asked if he calculated what would happen to me if he died. I asked if he thought about the empire, the legacy, the partnership. He looked at me steadily. He said he didn't care about the empire. In that moment, when the van hit the container, he didn't care about the legacy. He said he only cared that I was breathing. He said that for a man who claimed not to trade lives, he realized he would trade his own for mine, without blinking. I stared at him. This was the man who had terrified the city. The man who had been called a monster, a machine, a warlord. And he was lying here, stitched up and broken, telling me that I was the only thing that mattered. I leaned down and kissed him. It was soft, tasting of salt and tears. I whispered the words I hadn't been brave enough to say when the sun was shining. I told him I loved him. Julian closed his eyes. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for years. He said he loved me too. He said he loved me from the moment I walked up his stairs in the rain. I stayed with him all night. I sat in the chair, watching the monitors beep, holding his hand. But as the sun came up, painting the city in soft pinks and oranges, my mind shifted from love back to war. Silas Sterling had tried to kill us. He had hurt Julian. He had tried to burn down what we built. I looked at the gun I had placed on the nightstand. Silas thought he had struck a blow. He thought he had weakened the Blackwood Empire by taking out the king. He forgot about the queen. He forgot that while Julian was the muscle, I was the strategist. And now, I wasn't just fighting for survival. I wasn't just fighting for territory. I was fighting for revenge. I picked up my phone. I dialed the number for the head of security. I told him to find Silas Sterling. I told him to use every resource, every contact, every dirty trick we had. I wanted to know where he slept, where he ate, and who he trusted. I looked at Julian sleeping. I promised him silently that by the time he could walk again, Silas Sterling would be a memory. This was the sacrifice. This was the cost of the crown. You didn't just get to wear the jewels. You had to wash the blood off them first. And I was ready to get my hands dirty. 2 years later, the view from the penthouse balcony looked different. The city was the same grid of lights stretching out to the horizon, the same dark ribbon of the Hudson River, but the way I looked at it had changed. I wasn't looking at it as a fugitive anymore. I wasn't looking at it as a victim searching for a hiding place. I was looking at it as a board that I helped control. The wind up here was cold, a reminder that winter was coming, but I didn't shiver. I was wearing a coat made of cashmere and silk, one of my own designs from the fall collection that had just debuted at Fashion Week. The critics had called it armored elegance. They didn't know how right they were. The Elena Vance wasn't just a shop anymore. It was an institution. We had expanded to 3 floors. My client list was a fortress of influential women who trusted me with their bodies for fittings and their secrets for safekeeping. And the intelligence network? It was flawless. Julian and I had refined the system. We didn't just gather gossip, we curated it. We traded information like currency. We stopped wars before they started by leaking the right whisper to the right ear. We had brought a strange, terrifying kind of peace to the underworld. I heard the glass door slide open behind me. I didn't turn. I knew his footsteps. Even after 2 years, the sound of him walking into a room made my pulse jump. Julian joined me at the railing. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood close enough that his arm brushed mine, a silent transfer of warmth. He placed a glass of wine on the stone ledge for me. He looked out at the city. He looked tired, but it was a good tired. The exhaustion of a man who had spent the day building, not destroying. He asked if I was thinking about the anniversary. I smiled. I told him I wasn't. I told him I was thinking about how far we had come since the night I showed up on his doorstep looking like a drowned rat. He chuckled. The sound was low and rough. He said I didn't look like a rat. He said I looked like a storm that had decided to wear a dress. I turned to face him. He was wearing a white shirt, the top buttons undone, sleeves rolled up to reveal the faint white scar on his forearm where a knife had missed its mark a year ago. He looked older than he had when we first met. There were a few silver strands in his dark hair now, earning their place among the shadows. I reached out and touched his face. I told him he needed a haircut. He caught my hand and kissed the palm. He said he was busy. I asked him how the meeting with my father went. That was the new normal. My father, Robert Vance, and I had a relationship now. It wasn't warm. It wasn't fuzzy. We didn't do Sunday dinners. But it was respectful. He respected power, and I had accumulated enough of it that he could no longer dismiss me. Julian smiled. He said Robert was Robert. He tried to renegotiate the shipping tariffs on the Jersey docks. Julian had reminded him that we knew about his offshore accounts in the Caymans. The negotiation ended quickly after that. I laughed. I said my father never learned. Julian shrugged. He said some men couldn't learn. They only understood force. He looked at me then, his expression shifting. The playfulness vanished, replaced by that intense, winter-gray focus that always made me feel like I was the only person in the world. He said he had something for me. My heart skipped a beat. I asked if it was another dossier, another mole to hunt. He shook his head. He reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small velvet box. It wasn't black. It was deep, emerald green, the color of the atelier. He didn't kneel. Kneeling was for subjects, and we had established long ago that there were no subjects in this partnership. We stood eye to eye. He opened the box. Inside sat a ring. It wasn't the massive, ostentatious diamond that a man like Caleb Sterling would have bought to show off his wealth. It was a single, flawless stone, cut in a sharp, geometric shape that caught the light like a prism. It was set in a band of dark platinum that twisted around itself, looking both delicate and unbreakable. I stared at it. My throat went tight. Julian spoke softly. He said he had been carrying this around for 3 months. He said he kept waiting for the perfect moment. A quiet dinner, a trip to Paris. But then he realized that quiet wasn't us. Paris wasn't us. He gestured to the city below us, to the lights, to the invisible web of power we held in our hands. He said this was us, standing on the edge of the world we conquered, knowing that we could fall at any moment but choosing to stand anyway. He took the ring out of the box. He took my left hand. He slid off the simple promise band he had given me 2 years ago. He looked me in the eye. He told me that this wasn't a contract. He said contracts could be broken. He told me this wasn't an ownership deed. He said he didn't want to own me, and he knew I couldn't be owned. He said this was a vow. He slid the ring onto my finger. It fit perfectly. Of course it did. He knew my measurements better than I did. He held my hand tight. He said, "Elena Vance, you are not a bargaining chip. You are not a peace treaty. You are not disposable." He said I was his equal, his partner, his conscience when he went too dark, and his courage when the odds were impossible. He asked me to marry him, not to merge our families, not to secure a territory, but because he couldn't imagine waking up a single day for the rest of his life without seeing my face on the pillow next to him. I looked at the ring. I looked at the man. I thought about the girl I used to be, the girl who had stood in a bridal suite, terrified and alone, listening to men plot her death. That girl felt like a stranger now, a distant memory of a past life. I looked at Julian. I saw the scar on his neck from the warehouse explosion. I saw the lines around his eyes from worrying about my safety. I saw the love that he didn't speak often, but proved every single day by treating me like a queen with a sword, not a princess in a tower. I smiled. I felt tears prick my eyes, but they were happy tears. I told him yes. I told him I would marry him. I told him I would fight with him, bleed with him, and build with him. I told him that as long as we were standing together, I didn't care who came for us. Let Silas Sterling's ghosts come. Let my father try his schemes. Let the world try to tear us down. We were the storm. Julian let out a breath and pulled me into him. He kissed me, and it felt like coming home. It felt like the final piece of the puzzle snapping into place. We stood there for a long time, holding each other in the cold wind. Later, we went inside. We sat by the fire, drinking the wine, talking about the wedding. We decided it would be small. No press, no political invites, just the people who actually mattered. My mother, who had finally found the courage to leave my father and move into a condo I bought for her. My sister, Chloe, who was now my top apprentice at the atelier and learning to spot a lie faster than she could spot a loose thread. And Julian's inner circle, the men who had bled for us. It wouldn't be the wedding of the century. It wouldn't be a royal affair. It would be ours. And as I sat there, watching the firelight dance on the sharp facets of the diamond on my finger, I realized the most important lesson of all, the lesson I would teach my sister, and maybe one day, my own daughter. I realized that power wasn't given. It wasn't inherited, and it certainly wasn't married into. Power was what happened when you refused to be what everyone else wanted you to be. They wanted me to be a victim. I became a witness. They wanted me to be a pawn. I became a player. They wanted me to be a wife. I became a partner. I looked at Julian. He caught my eye and smiled, raising his glass in a silent toast. I raised mine back, to the gamblers, to the runners, to the girls who burned their wedding dresses and built empires from the ashes. We made it. Thank you for listening to Elena and Julian's story. It's a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is underestimate a woman who has nothing left to lose. If you enjoyed this story of betrayal, revenge, and a love that burned down the world, please hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know you want more dark romances like this one, and I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What would you have done if you were in Elena's shoes? Would you have run to the enemy, or would you have tried to fight your father? Let me know. Until next time, keep your secrets close, and your partners closer.